what's really new is smart technologies and smart systems. We see it in our homes, we see it in our cars, we see it in our pockets with our phones. There's more and more Internet of Things, interconnected technologies, apps, and systems that can do this through algorithms and through automated ways. And even in stormwater, at least, there's algorithms that are going to the cloud and looking for the weather forecasts and saying, okay, if I'm exceeding a certain percentage chance of rainfall, and that rainfall is going to exceed a certain depth, I'm going to do something different automatically. I don't have to send somebody out and turn a valve or put in a stop log or take a stop log out. It all is actuated remotely in the cloud. It can happen at 2 a.m. on any day you want in response to the forecast. And so we wanted to look at these smart systems and say, is this a way that can help us with these extreme events and storage?
Hey there, welcome to the Stormwater World Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of the Stormwater World Podcast. So today we're going to talk about extreme weather, specifically extreme precipitation events that have been occurring a lot more frequently over the last few years, and how those events are impacting our stormwater infrastructure and how we can respond. And on top of that, a lot of our infrastructure across the country is aging and is also undersized for these events. So what is the solution that stormwater managers have, and at what cost? And then ultimately, how do we overcome this challenge, not only fiscally, but also environmentally? So let me introduce our guest today, who's going to help me save the world in the next 30 minutes, as I just put that challenge out there. Dr. Andy Erickson is with us today. He is a PhD and PE. He's a research manager at the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory and the University of Minnesota, and a registered professional engineer in Minnesota. Dr. Erickson's research pursues an understanding of water quality in urban and agricultural watersheds, assessment and maintenance of stormwater treatment practices, and developing new stormwater treatment technologies, such as the iron-enhanced sand filter. Dr. Erickson is also a lead author for the book Optimizing Stormwater Treatment Practices, a handbook of assessment and maintenance, and he's also the editor of the University of Minnesota Stormwater newsletter, which we will link to that newsletter. I get that newsletter, and so we'll link to that newsletter in the show notes so everybody can check that out. And it goes out to approximately 2,000 email subscribers. And Dr. Erickson also leads the Minnesota Stormwater seminar series for approximately 200 stormwater practitioners per month. He's given over 300 presentations, along with guest lectures and 1 to 2 day professional trainings and workshops. Dr. Erickson, or can I call you Andy?
Please call me Andy.
Call you Andy for the podcast? Andy, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. And I apologize, that was a mouthful, but I wanted people to know who they're getting to listen to today.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Maybe I can wake them up after that long intro.
Hey, we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I just told everyone we're basically saving the world from extreme weather today. So let's get after it. What's going on, and what can we do?
Extreme weather events is a big challenge, and everybody sees it. It's in the news. It doesn't matter where you live. You see it in the news. You see these rainfall events causing massive floods, massive damage. And if we look at projections, if we think about not only where it's been, where it is today, but thinking about going into the future, some of the projections are saying 70% increase in these extreme events, more frequency in these extreme events in New England, and even out in the West, in the arid West, 5 to 10 to 15% increases in these extreme events. So it doesn't matter where you are. This is a problem for all of us, and we have to figure out how we're going to deal with it, because not only is our infrastructure aging and wearing out, and we have to replace it, it's undersized for what we see today compared to when it was built.
So what's the standard? My wife is a PE, civil engineer, and so she's always trying to school me on this, and I do my best. But it was 100. What are we building towards? 100-year rain event? It seems like we have them all the time, but I know that's not the right way to look at it. Can you explain that? how we design stuff.
Yeah, and it depends a little bit on where you're at, on what the design philosophy is, or what the design standard is. But if we want to back up a bit and think about what those designs were based on. So the original design standard, much of the infrastructure that we have in the US especially, but even North America and other parts of the world, was based on rainfall and precipitation data from like the 1940s to the 1960s. And so we size our pipes, our ponds, our storage systems based on precip from mid 20th century. And that could be, if it's conveyance, it could be a 10-year event, it could be a 25-year event, it could be a 100-year event. It really depends on where you are, what the design criteria are. And if I want to explain that a little bit, a 10-year event, what does it mean to be a 10-year event? It's statistically, in the long term, that's an event that happens once every 10 years. But when we go out to like the 100-year event, we only have 150 years of rainfall data. How can we really know what the statistics are for an event that should only happen once every 100 years when we only have 150 years of data total? So we have to understand that a little bit. We have to think about what's the data, what are our assumptions based on, and where do we go from there? So there's that return interval concept, once every 10 years, once every 25 years, once every 100 years. But then again, what is the foundation? A lot of the original designs were from data from the 1940s to the 1960s. More recently, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, released Atlas 14. They're currently working on Atlas 15, which is exciting and something to keep your finger on and watch for that. But Atlas 14 was updating all of that design frequency, those return interval storms. What is a 10-year storm? What is a 25-year storm? What's a 100-year storm? So we have new numbers. And what's really interesting to me, and when I'm looking at extreme events, I'm going to talk a bit more about how do we adapt to it here shortly. What I found when we're looking at the data, and we focused on Minnesota and the Midwest because that's where our funding sources come from, but the work we did could be done anywhere. So I encourage you, if you don't have it in your area, to do what we did and see what it looks like for you. But what we saw is fewer or less frequent small events. And when I'm saying small events, I'm talking the 2-year and even the 10-year event. So we have fewer of those smaller events because we are seeing more of the bigger events, the 25-year, the 50-year, the 100-year event. And if I want to give you a little bit of statistics on that, we see the current Atlas 14 design standards, or the precip projections for today, what we're using for design, is actually less. It's smaller storms for the 2 and 10-year event than it was in the 1940s and 1960s. Like I said, we see fewer of these small events, so that return interval actually decreases. But for everything beyond that, the what was a 25-year event previously under TP40, which is again 1940s and 1960s, what was a 25-year event is now, I have that backwards. What was a 50-year event is now less than the 25-year event under current rainfalls. So that's how much it's increased. It's increasing 20 to 30%. Another way to think about it is what we would design for is somewhere between 20 and 40% more now. So that's what's saying our infrastructure is undersized. What we made previously as a 1-foot pipe or a 2-foot pipe now needs to be 20 to 30 or more % larger just to handle what rainfalls we get today. And that's not even thinking about what might happen in the future.
Gotcha. I was definitely tracking because I thought you were going to really zing me and be like, oh, 25, it's 1.5 years or 3 years or something like that. Oh, but 50 to less than 25, it's still a dramatic change.
It's a big change.
So at least I was tracking there with you. So how do we adapt? Where do we go from here? So obviously so let's back up. Let's clarify.
Yeah.
So we've identified the issue. The new designs we're taking into account. It sounds like hopefully we're taking into account the new rainfall data, and we're still going to over-engineer, or I shouldn't say over-engineer. I know that's a
conservative engineering.
like we should assume a higher level to 20 to 40% higher,
Yeah.
right? So we're doing the right thing, hopefully, going forward.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying though is, I mean, there's a lot of pipe in the ground.
There is a
So
lot of
how do we adapt? So how do we adapt without ripping all that out? Because
we can't afford
we
it.
can't even.
Yeah, we can't afford it.
Seems like we can't afford to properly inspect our bridges these days. Not to get too crazy on what's going on in current events in our news and stuff, but I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure issues out there outside of just stormwater. So what are these poor stormwater managers? What can they do?
The thing to keep in mind is, yes, A, undersized. B, we have a lot of infrastructure in place. We have millions and really billions of dollars, even within individual cities, of infrastructure that is not only aging but undersized according to these new precip numbers. There's not enough money out there to replace it all today. But many cities, they have capital improvement plans. They implement projects as they go. They do street reconstructions, and things get updated piecemeal as we go. And that's good that we have new rainfall data to help us better size the conveyance in our stormwater management. But the other question is, we haven't yet changed. We've changed the rainfall depths we're using, but we haven't changed what you asked in the beginning: what event should we be sizing for? If you think about the Houston storm, that was a 1,000-year event. We had a somewhere between 600 and 800-year recurrent interval event in Duluth, Minnesota. And is that what we should be sizing for? What risk and reward do we really need to be designing for? Because we're seeing more frequent large events. We're seeing these, what I'd say, almost catastrophic events that we never expect our systems to deal with, but the public does. So that's the other half of the question, is what should be our level of risk that we are willing to assume? And then once we have that, if we know what our precip projections are, if we know what level of risk we're going to assume in our designs, then we can start thinking about how do we adapt? Where do we get there? How do we get there? And so part of the research, we've done quite a bit of modeling, and we've looked at a number of different ways that we could get out of this situation. And I'm focusing on the urban landscapes. What can we do with our stormwater management systems that will get us there? And we looked at examples of storage. I mean, that's the default extreme event, large volume solution, is we just need more storage. So we looked at more stormwater ponds. We looked at underground storage. But we also want to look at green infrastructure. If you look at some of the studies that have been done in Philadelphia and other large CSO communities, they're getting out of their CSO problems with green infrastructure. So it's not where Chicago has deep tunnels and large underground storage. Other communities are saying, you know what, let's infiltrate. And we can deal with extreme events. We can deal with a lot of rainfall with our green infrastructure. So we included that in our analysis. And we also, what's really new is smart technologies and smart systems. We see it in our homes. We see it in our cars. We see it in our pockets with our phones. There's more and more Internet of Things, interconnected technologies, apps, and systems that can do this through algorithms and through automated ways. And even in stormwater, at least, there's algorithms that are going to the cloud and looking for the weather forecasts and saying, okay, if I'm exceeding a certain percentage chance of rainfall, and that rainfall is going to exceed a certain depth, I'm going to do something different automatically. I don't have to send somebody out and turn a valve or put in a stop log or take a stop log out. It all is actuated remotely in the cloud. It can happen at 2 a.m. on any day you want in response to the forecast. And so we wanted to look at these smart systems and say, is this a way that can help us with these extreme events and storage? So we looked at all of these things and we compared them. And if I break it down to the simplest things, and I can provide, if anybody's interested, you want to get really into the details, I have a lot more information. I got reports and presentations I can share. Don't hesitate to contact me. I'd love to share this information because there's a lot more that I have that we just can't cover today.
Sure. And anything that you'd like to share that's out there that doesn't, whatever, we can link that in the show notes.
I'll do that.
Anything that you would like to share to people? That's fantastic.
Excellent. I'll do that. I'll share a link and you can download the report and take a look at it. But again, reach out to me. My contact information will be there too. You can contact me as well. But
Yep.
if I just give you an idea of what would it take, if you want to answer the question, what would it take to get us out of this situation? And I'm going to start with maybe the easy one. If we just want to capture the 10-year event, again, under current precept, Atlas 14,
Okay.
if we want to capture the 10-year event and not have, it's not even not runoff. I'm saying if we don't want to have flooding in our urban systems.
Yeah.
We looked at 3 different watersheds. We did a bunch of modeling. We did a bunch of scenarios. We talked with the jurisdiction owners and really ground truth what we found. And we saw that you'd have to have on the order of 5% of your watershed as storage, as stormwater ponds to prevent flooding. 5% of your total watershed. That's not the impervious area. It's everything. 5%. 1 acre out of every 20 acres has to be all stormwater pond. But that's just the 10-year event. When we go to infiltration basins, rain gardens, green infrastructure, and I'm going to come back to this because there's a really important assumption we make around green infrastructure that's actually hindering us. But when we looked at rain gardens and infiltration systems, 12% of the entire watershed had to be infiltration basins just to capture the 10-year event and prevent flooding. If we go to the 100-year event, which again is not common for stormwater storage, but again, I asked the question, what level of risk should we be willing to take and allow, and when can it fail? When we go to the 100-year event, it's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary. If I start again with ponds, we saw with just standard stormwater ponds, 12% of the watershed has to be stormwater pond to capture the 100-year event. However, if you retrofit and or with your new ponds, make them smart ponds. And when I say smart ponds, very generic, simple definition is that you have an automated system that looks at the weather forecast, and before it rains, it drains out 50% of that storage volume, that dead storage, that permanent pool storage. It drains out 50% of that volume before the rain hits, so that you have more storage capacity when the rain falls. So that's how we define smart systems. Not all smart systems are like that. Obviously, you can tailor and make them your own, but that was our simple, generic assumption on smart systems. If you go to smart systems, you only need 9% of the watershed to be stormwater ponds as smart ponds to capture the 100-year event. But if you go to infiltration practices, 25% of the watershed has to be your green infrastructure. 1 acre out of every 4 acres is all rain garden or infiltration basin. And that's, how are we going to do that in the urban landscape? I mean, I'm all for greening our urban landscapes. I'm not against it at all. We need more green spaces in our urban landscapes. It's shown in medical journals, it's shown in stormwater journals and ecological journals that green spaces in urban landscapes are better for our mental health, our physical health, our property values. There's many benefits of green infrastructure, and I think we should have more green spaces. But is 25% of the watershed green is a challenge. That's a lot of lost revenue.
Do you have any? Do you have any? Yeah, exactly. Do you have any dollars against any of that? Do you have any dollar examples? Not just for the build out, but then the lost opportunity cost. I mean,
it's huge. It's huge.
Well, you got to put a parking lot over there. If I put a parking lot over there, I'll lose from a commercial developer standpoint before we cared about the environment, right?
Yeah.
So same idea, right? Like, you've got this land, but 25% of it is just going to be pretty. It is functional, but it's also just going to be all those other things. So, do you have any dollars that you put to any of this?
We have some numbers. We certainly have some numbers. The challenge with numbers is it's very site specific. So, like I said, we modeled 3 watersheds and we came up with some averages. And those numbers are going to be true for Minnesota about 2 years ago now. So, thinking about inflation, these numbers are going to change quite a bit. But I'll give you a few numbers just to give you an idea of ballpark.
Sure.
So if you want to compare scenarios, you got to have a baseline. And our baseline was operation and maintenance of existing infrastructure. Because if you're not operating, maintaining your existing stormwater infrastructure, I'm not talking about pipes, catch basins, curbs and gutters, streets. I'm talking your infiltration basins, your stormwater ponds, your filter strips and swales, your legit stormwater treatment practices. Okay.
That aren't being maintained. Did we any of that? They're just
Yeah.
we're making an assumption that the money is actually being spent to maintain these things, because that's a whole nother conversation.
That is
right?
very
That's
true. There's two assumptions there. There's one, A, they're being maintained, and B, there's enough money for them to be maintained properly. And those are two different questions. And that's, as you probably know, and many people listening in know, there's a lot of money that goes to capital to build things. There's very little money that goes to operating and maintaining them. And that's woefully underfunded. And honestly, I mean, this is my personal opinion. But if you were going to game the system, because the current funding structure and system, and this is a whole nother talk, but the current funding, the current funding system incentivizes building things and implementing things, and de-emphasizes operating and maintaining your existing infrastructure, or even rehabilitating your existing infrastructure. You can get a grant to rebuild a rain garden from scratch long before you can get a grant to actually maintain a fairly decent rain garden. So what that means is, I can imagine a city manager sitting at this and looking at where they can get money for it and be like, you know what? I'm not going to maintain this rain garden. I'm going to let it fail in 5 years or 10 years, long before its life cycle, and then I'll get a grant to rebuild it. Because I can get money to rebuild it. I can't get money to maintain it. That's a scary thought to me. And that's not, I mean, that's our society these days. Stuff just isn't built to last anymore. It's meant to be replaced and not repaired. But I don't think we can go that way with our stormwater stuff. But that's another.
I didn't mean to get you on another box. So we'll go back to like just a baseline. We're gonna make assumptions.
Yeah. So let's make assumptions about O&M. So if you're just doing the recommended O&M and you have the money to do that, for some of our watersheds, and again, the details are in the report, so you got to take these numbers in context for their specific watersheds. But somewhere between $2 and about $7.5 million over 20 years was the baseline operation and maintenance of the existing stormwater treatment infrastructure in the watersheds that we looked at. Now, all of these costs are going to exclude land costs. So when you're implementing new practices, in addition to your existing, we didn't factor in land costs because that's even more variable than all the other things that I'm talking about. But your baseline costs were somewhere between $2 and $7.5 million. To retrofit existing stormwater ponds, and in our watersheds that we looked at, in Minnesota, we use a lot of stormwater ponds. And I know that's true for other parts of the country, but in Minnesota especially, we use a lot of stormwater ponds. So there's a lot of existing stormwater ponds out there, and you could go out and retrofit those ponds with a smart system. You can make use of existing infrastructure to increase capacity without any new land being used. And the costs to do that were somewhere between 5 and 20 million. Okay, so now that's on top of the baseline operation and maintenance, but that was the next most, or I should say least expensive adaptation strategy, was retrofitting smart ponds into existing ponds. The next one from there is building new ponds. So our watersheds that we looked at, they weren't fully built out, and they didn't have stormwater ponds or stormwater treatment treating all of the impervious surface. To build out those watersheds and expand it so that stormwater treatment, in this case stormwater ponds, covered all the contributing areas, that was somewhere in the order of 20 to 50 million. So now we're treating all the water, we're capturing it all, and we're trying to get to that no flooding scenario.
Right.
Now, if you combine those last two options that I just said, if you retrofit your existing ponds to make them smart, and you build new ponds to make sure all of your contributing areas are treated, but those new ponds are also smart ponds, that was somewhere between 50 and 120 million to do all of it. So it begins to add up pretty quickly. Now, here's where, again, based on the assumptions, and these are things that I want to do more research on coming up. When we looked at rain gardens, green infrastructure, infiltration basins, there's a lot of variability in the expected maintenance of these systems. If you want to have a rain garden that works, it has to have good vegetation. But some rain gardens are in highly visible areas. There's actually a paper out there, and I can link this if people are interested. There's a paper out there that looked at green infrastructure in different parts of the urban landscape, and they showed very clearly where rain gardens were in highly visible, high traffic areas, they were maintained more, and more money was invested in those rain gardens than similar rain gardens in the same city, but in less trafficked or less visible areas. It gets to that old adage, out of sight, out of mind. So
Exactly.
that's exactly what it
It's
is.
that's the industry. I feel like
It's totally the
our
industry.
industry
Absolutely.
for the. Oh man, don't get me on that. That's our whole goal. That's my soapbox, right?
You got to
Like,
get
let's
that.
get the word out there.
Yeah.
'Cause, you've been doing this longer than me. I'm only 13 years in, and I still feel nobody. I talk to my friends. They have no idea what I do. They have no idea. Like
Yeah.
my wife and I are always explaining to them what stormwater is.
You're probably like me. You go places, and our families are taking pictures of like statues and buildings and bridges and monuments and all these historic. And we're looking down, taking pictures of catch basins and rain gardens and soils and stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny.
So just from a simplistic standpoint, I think there's something to be said, especially if I understood you correctly, which, I mean, please jump on me if I didn't, but in a situation with the ponds and then the smart ponds, there's a lot, and the fact that people don't, and circling back around to maintenance always comes up every episode. We talk about maintenance. That's the dirty 4-letter word in stormwater maintenance. Let you guys all think about that. But there's a lot of money involved, like you said, in getting a pond up to speed, right? So you could have a big pond, it's been neglected 10 years, 20 years, and the original outlet, it's all gone. It's all sediment. Sediment's taking it over, and you're looking at a lot of money to fix that, where I think if you had a smart system that would drain it, maybe you could at least get back to its original design. You know what I'm saying? Like, because it's obviously it can't hold the capacity. If it's got water in it, it's going to flood faster. But at least if that smart pond you come in there, if it's cheaper than, I don't know, a $250,000 dredge, excavation, toxic waste, that extra cost, you can't just go sludge it and go dump it next door.
Right.
All the costs. So to fix that pond, if you could retrofit it with a smart pond, now you're giving them an excuse not to maintain it further. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? I think if everybody's thinking about that, like that could help you right now with the project that you have ongoing. You know, listen to this, where you're looking at this big cost tag where, I mean, I don't know, I'm familiar with a few different products out there, but I know it's well less than $250,000 to put in some of those types of devices. Even if you had to go find your outlet or whatever, even if you had to go put a new out, because it's all buried underneath the original structure. But yeah, man, that's interesting. And is that so if we start to bring that back down to, I hate to say reasonable numbers, but obviously you got to take data. You have to take data like that and say, okay, we can't do this in one big blanket.
Right.
So we got to be specific to each individual's needs. We need to look at our watersheds, or we need to look at our situation and say, okay, what type of rain are we getting? Everybody's afraid here in Texas now. I mean, we went through Harvey. When it starts and it rains, it either doesn't rain here or rains like it's not going to stop. And people just hold their breath. And Houston's designed to flood the way it's built. It is. But regardless, what is some of those practical applications? And maybe I'm stealing your thunder.
No.
Wrap back around, because we talked about how do we adapt to it. And we went off on the testing of this is what we figured out. Like, there is a problem. These are the options. These are the solutions potentially to the problem. But then how do we attack it on a fiscally responsible way? Right? Because again,
money. It's at the end of the day, it's all about the money. And so what we Big picture, what we found is that, just like you said, many of our stormwater ponds, and we can go back and we can look at why it is, but many of our stormwater ponds are over-designed. The original data that went into what set the design guidance was such that many of our stormwater ponds, originally the design was intended to be dredged out every 10 or 15 years, but there's stormwater ponds I'm seeing that haven't been dredged in 40 years because they're over-designed, and they are filling up with sediment, but it's much slower than what we originally anticipated. And those are great opportunities for smart systems. And like you said, many of these systems can be retrofit at a relatively low cost. You probably will still have to do a little bit of hydro modification on the outlet, and that's totally fine. That's way cheaper, as you said, than dredging or building a new pond or finding new sites for something. And that's existing infrastructure that's throughout our systems. And I've seen it, smart systems on wetlands, not natural wetlands, but constructed stormwater wetlands. I've seen it on any other system, that even dry ponds, dry systems that are most meant to just hold water temporarily. I've seen smart systems installed on the outlets to close the valve and hold as much water for as long as possible before opening it slowly once that water level gets to a certain elevation, and then let it out slowly. That actually improves and reduces flooding. It improves our strategic holding of water through our watersheds. And you're right, there are proprietary companies out there that can do this for you. They can install the equipment, they can build the dashboard for you, they give you full access, they maintain everything, they can make it do whatever you want it to do. And there are also DIY systems. There are people that are doing research on building these out of their own shops with Raspberry Pi little circuit boards, and pretty relatively cheap off-the-shelf sensors for water level, even flow actuation on valves and things like that. So it can be done on the cheap, and it can be done very professionally, very robust, very hands-off. I know some people, I got too much to do. I can't deal with one more button to turn. So if you can build a system that just works and just tells me every once in a while when I got to do something, that's what I need. Depending on where you are in the spectrum, there are options for doing smart systems. I think for our existing infrastructure, that's a golden opportunity to build more storage in our existing infrastructure. However, all of our modeling, at least for the watersheds that we did, it's not enough to get us out of the problem. It's not going to get us out of the water, pun intended. We need more. So we're going to have to build in more storage. We're going to have to think about, and I imagine at some point, we could have jurisdictions where we have smart systems throughout our watersheds, and it's responding in real time to water levels and holding back water in a very coordinated Internet of Things type way. And I see that's coming. In some places they're doing it a little bit, but I'm just imagining that's gonna build and grow even more. But I want to come back to green infrastructure and rain gardens, because I didn't even give you the numbers on rain gardens because they were even more than all the other numbers I quoted earlier. And the reason is we had to build so many rain gardens to actually mitigate flooding. But the problem is our design standards. We use a design storm, and that storm has two parts. It has the depth, the total precip depth, but it also has the intensity over time. And our design storms, historically, it was a type 2, SCS type 2, or depending on where you are in the country, it might have been a type 1, type 3, things like that. Atlas 14 implemented a new distribution of this intensity, but they are very similar in that on average, or if you break this down, 50% of the rainfall falls within 1 hour out of a 24-hour storm. 50%, half the rainfall is in just 1 hour. So it's super intense for that 1 hour. If you broaden that out, 80% of the rainfall is within 6 hours of that 24-hour storm. So 80% of the rain in only 25% of the time. Now think about what that means for our green infrastructure. If we have all the rain, or the vast majority of the rain, coming in a very short period of time, our infiltration-based systems, they can't possibly hope to keep up. Right. Our infiltration rates are just way less. If you think about a storm, so in Minnesota, our 100-year event is 7.5 inches in 24 hours. Okay. We get 50% of that, 3.75 inches in 1 hour. But our infiltration rates can't keep up with the fact that these rain gardens are like 10 to 1, 20 to 1 contributing area to treatment area. So that 3.75 inches might become 33 inches or 50 inches just in 1 hour. How can an infiltration basin possibly hope to infiltrate that? So we have a project right now where we're going back to that design assumption and saying, how realistic is that? You said where it rains where you are, it can downpour and it feels like it's never going to end, right? We feel that too. We don't think real storms represent these design storms that we've been using for decades. And I quoted a Duluth, Minnesota storm. We plotted that against this typical design standard. It didn't look anywhere close. But that 600 to 800 year event, return interval event, was still massive. But rain gardens could work with the intensities that storm brought. So we're looking at that right now. We're trying to compare differences between existing rainfall events, real rainfall events, and our current design standards on intensity versus time to see, do we need to change that paradigm? If you go to Pennsylvania, Villanova University has been doing a lot of work with the state of Pennsylvania and specifically the city of Philadelphia on their stormwater design standards. And they are changing the way they look at design stormwater. One, they're allowing what's called dynamic design. They're allowing us to assume there's infiltration happening during an event, which is absolutely true. Most design guidance doesn't allow you to do that. They say you have to capture it all, and then you can allow it to infiltrate. Okay. So that's one shift.
I don't know anything. That just doesn't even make sense to me.
I know.
I was like, it's still, the ground's not, it's not, it just doesn't make any sense. It's still going to go down like a little bit.
It's going to go down.
Like while it's raining.
It's going to do something.
It doesn't, what's the thought process behind that?
So,
like what the original thought, there's got to be a thought process.
That's the funny thing. Yeah. If you go back, and so many of our stormwater manuals, which is where our state stormwater manuals come from, is the design guidance that our stormwater designs come from. If you go back, if you look at the stormwater manuals across the U.S., many of them are almost quoted verbatim to the Prince George's County Design Manual out of Maryland that came out in the 90s, or even there might have been drafts earlier than the 90s. And that original manual doesn't have a lot of references or citations. We can't actually track where a lot of those recommendations or what have now become requirements come from. My personal opinion, and again, I'm totally speculating because we can't find out. We don't know. But I think, okay, this is what we think is good, but let's be a little conservative because we don't know. We thought about uncertainty, but we never really measured uncertainty decades ago. Now we're measuring uncertainty. We're getting a handle on what is our uncertainty. What do we know? What do we don't know? But back then we didn't. And so I think it's okay, let's be conservative and say, you know what, infiltration is going to be slow. Let's just assume it doesn't happen. And that'll be part of our design guidance. Let's take this storm event. And I saw one event that had this super flashy. That's a pretty rare circumstance, but you know what? Maybe we should design for that. And again, if you think about in the 80s and things like that, 80s and 90s especially, we had a lot more CSOs. And we wanted to prevent overflows. So let's get the worst case scenario then. And so I feel like our design guidance has built on conservative assumption, factor of safety on conservative assumption to a point where it's like we're limiting our toolbox. And that's what we saw with rain gardens. When we did this study following current design guidance, rain gardens were not the way to go. Green infrastructure was not the way to go. It just couldn't get you there. Not only fiscally, but even feasibly. It just wasn't even realistic to rebuild our watersheds to put in enough green infrastructure. But if we change that design assumption, one of the things we did, we looked at these rain gardens and we saw, and this figure is in the report, and I can share it as well, but for rain gardens in general, under the current design guidance, we saw 60% runoff during these large events, 8% infiltration in the rain gardens, and about 33% infiltration just in the green spaces in our watersheds. Okay, so in a green infrastructure outfitted city, 60% runoff, 8% of that total volume from the rainfall event, 8% infiltrated in rain gardens, and 33% infiltrated in impervious areas. We keep the storm depth the same, and all we changed was the intensity. We went to the far other end of the spectrum and said, what if it rains constant over 24 hours? It's still 7.5 inches in that 24 hours, but it's constant instead of a whole bunch right in the middle. We saw 80% infiltration in the pervious areas. It goes from 33% infiltration in pervious areas to 80% infiltration in pervious areas. The amount that infiltrated in the rain gardens increased by 50%. And runoff from the watershed went from 60% in this kind of high intensity, really, in my opinion, conservative assumption, down to just 11% runoff out of the watersheds. So changing that one design assumption, that the intensity had a huge impact on the results. And it would totally change how we would plan in our urban landscapes. So we're doing research right now. We want to understand. I don't think it's at that far. I mean, like I said, that's the far other end of that assumption is uniform. We're trying to do the research now to find out where in the middle is reality. So I hope to have answers for that soon.
At this point, don't we have the tech to just figure out the real average rainfall intensities over,
Absolutely,
say, the last year or somewhere? Can't we just real time design this stuff at this point? Don't we have that kind of? I'm a tech nerd, right? I want to be able to go, hey, generative AI, I need a design based on the real time data and this particular geographic location, take into account the intensity of the rain, not just the volume, and take into account the infiltration rates, and then give me a design that's 20% higher than the average you come up with. I mean, doesn't the tech, instead of going back to these old crusty books that we got and these tables and charts, does that exist? Is that kind of what you're saying, that where we're hopefully trying to get to? I mean, it doesn't solve, originally we started talking about, well, this is the future. We really started talking about, and I do want to kind of circle back around and close up with some additional thoughts on that. We talked about the retrofitter. What can we do now? Because you can't, all these things we're talking about doesn't really help. I guess it could with the rain garden aspect, but let me just finish my question. Does that tech exist or not? Are we?
Yes, it's out there. It's out there, and we're collecting it. We're doing another project right now where we're analyzing over 1,000 rainfall stations right here in the Midwest. And our minimum criteria is they have to have 70 years of data, and many of our stations have upwards of 140 years of data. And the more recent data is definitely much finer resolution, much more accurate. We understand that but I do want to caution people, think about if we are seeing more intense events or more frequent extreme events, let's think about that technology. What is the rain gauge actually doing? And many of our tipping bucket rain gauges, if you go to the manufacturer's instructions for how you calibrate that thing, many of those are limited to 1 inch per hour or less. That's the highest capacity that they can capture. And if our rain gauges are limited in what it can measure, that's going to influence all that data.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
But we got to
start over.
But you're absolutely right. All the tech is out there. The data is out there. We can do this. And that's what some of the new design standards are going towards, is saying, well, let's look at the last 10 years of data. And so that is a moving, dynamic design standard that just looks at the most recent 10 years. It tells you prescriptively how to pull stuff out of that to figure out what do you need to design for. So that's already happening.
But I would assume there's no rules and regulations that says you have to do it that way. So a lot of people just punt to the old way, because I would also be willing to bet that it's cheaper doing it the old way still. Going through the
is it cheaper?
Am I being cynical? Because anytime, because I got back in a different life, right? When I got my lead certification, it was all fine and good. It sounded good, but it's more expensive. And if you don't do the O&M, it's really hard to show that owner that payback where he spent that additional 30% on his build. So I'm wondering, is that a situation again where we're getting to this and the developers are going, or the city or whoever? Again, unfortunately, we're back to money, right? the engineering firm, they're like, oh, well, we could do it this way, or we could look over it that way. And the person footing the bill is like, I mean, who's going to tell us?
Right.
Are they going to tell us we can't do it this way? Is that against the?
Yeah.
So where are we in a regulatory landscape for some of these things?
And probably many of the audience know, the regulations, they start out at the federal level, they trickle down to the state level, and then they trickle ultimately to the local jurisdictional level. And in general, the federal level, it has its points, and then the states can either default to that, or they can be more restrictive. They can be more innovative beyond that and require something more or different. And then when you get down to the city level, then they can do it even again and go more. They can't go less. They still have to meet the state and federal requirements, but at the city level, they can go above and beyond if they want to. And there are certainly some jurisdictions that are doing that. There are certainly some consultants that are doing that for their clients. But at the same time, there are plenty that are saying, you know what, I've always done it this way. This is how I know how to do it. I've got way too much to do to try to do something new or learn something new or get over this learning curve and adopt new technology. I can only handle what we've done before. And there's many consulting firms. I mean, honestly, like you said, it gets back to money. There's money in taking the same design or the same philosophy and just replicating it everywhere. Because the first time is expensive. Every time after that, you make money on it. And that's just the reality of capitalism. But there are many people out there that are leading the charge, and they are innovating, and they are trying to do what's different and better for the purpose of getting us somewhere new and changing that status quo. So it's out there. It's available. I encourage you, if you're looking for that and you don't feel like you know who those people are or who to ask, reach out to us and go to some of these conferences and attend the presentations and see what people are doing, and then go talk to them. And because we have a strong network here in Stormwater, and I've never had anybody that didn't like to answer questions. So don't be afraid to ask them. Yeah, right. You know what I mean? It's a really good community to share knowledge, and for those that want to be innovative, we can innovate together.
Let's wrap up with some thoughts about, let's go back to existing conditions and retrofits. It sounds like increasing ponds and whatnot, yeah. But any other practical applications other than just the rain garden? Or is it, to me, it sounds like it's always a trained process. It's a system, right? Yeah. It sounds like the rain garden works better if the flow rates are less, and flow rate will be better if you put a smart, turn your regular pond into a smart pond, and it that trickle down, like you said before. Is that kind of like your overall, if I'm pulling it all together, or is there some other things, practical blocking and tackling you would give to, if I'm that stormwater manager, that's Andy, help me out.
What do I do?
You know, I can go find some money, but I'm just afraid to put my money in the wrong spot.
Yeah.
So what can I do? And I know everybody's going to be a little different case by case, but in general, do you have any thoughts about, and we can stick to just, not necessarily, because we haven't really touched on water quality itself. We can just stick to flooding.
This is all water quality.
I'm just trying to minimize my flooding. Uh-huh. What is your practical thoughts for that stormwater manager?
So here's what I'd say are the big takeaways. So number one, if you have existing storage, whether those are stormwater ponds, underground, doesn't matter. If you are storing water somewhere, and that could be permanent storage where you have a pool of water all the time, or it could be dry storage where it's only temporarily full of water. If you want to take advantage of that existing storage infrastructure, consider applying smart systems to it. And if you're not sure about it, just try it once. You know what I mean? You often don't have a lot to lose, and you have a whole lot to gain if it works for you. Try it once, try it somewhere, do a pilot, or talk to somebody that has done it, get their input, and try it. Because I think that's a low-hanging fruit opportunity. It's relatively low cost to take existing infrastructure to the next level for providing storage and minimizing flooding as best we can. So that's number one. Number two, even though you might struggle to convince somebody with models and the cost of things that green infrastructure can help us out of this problem, because again, many of our design assumptions really don't favor green infrastructure and infiltration-based systems, even pervious areas. Don't be afraid to use those, because they are working and they can help us with extreme events more frequent extreme events, and even high intensity events. I feel like, again, the design assumptions undervalue this green infrastructure methodology and processes. So don't be afraid of rain gardens. They can help us. But you may get pushback if somebody says, show me the numbers, show me the data, because the current design guidance doesn't favor it. So that's number two. And then if you've done that, if you've implemented existing storage, you've maybe implemented a mix of rain gardens. And I think actually, honestly, our urban watersheds have to be a mix of things. There is no silver bullet. You can't just build ponds everywhere, and you can't just build rain gardens everywhere. We have to have a mix, because we have certain places that need to hold back water longer, or et cetera. So don't be afraid to have a mix of tools in your landscape. That's totally fine. But think about that strategically, and think about what are your important priorities and what are your goals, where are your site-specific, maybe sensitive points, touch points, and that can be both from a ecological, water, stormwater side, or it could be a political side. Think about that, and think about those strategically, and then build in what you can build in. But above all, obviously, you have to start with your current local regulations. You can certainly go above and beyond what's required, but you got to make sure you're at least meeting the minimum requirements, or that's a whole nother can of worms you don't want to deal with. So make sure you follow local regulations. Take advantage of existing storage. Make it smart. That's a low-hanging, low-cost fruit. Don't be afraid of green infrastructure. It can help you. It can help us with these problems, and it's going to help us in the future. And think of your entire system, your entire jurisdiction as a system. That's the one mindset I haven't mentioned yet. We often focus at site scale. We think about sites, and we might think as, yes, it fits into the whole watershed, but let's think about how the whole watershed can fit together and work together on a much broader scale. So that's another big picture for people to think about.
Got it. Man, I'm pretty sure you're going to have to come back at some point. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully everybody will glean some information out of it, or at least know that you're out there and reach out to you.
My pleasure.
And ask questions. It doesn't make any sense not to. He said you could.
That's right.
I mean, I'm sure he's a busy guy, but he'll make time.
Absolutely.
Because we're all trying to get to the same goal. Dr. Erickson, Andy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks, everybody. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks so much.